We recognize that the Hogan Administrative Center occupies the land of the Ho-Chunk people. Please take a moment to celebrate and honor this ancestral Ho-Chunk land and the sacred lands of all Indigenous peoples. Will the Secretary please call the roll?
Ms. Bowman? Here. Ms. Berkedal?
Absent.
Dr. Cooper-Stoll?
Here.
Dr. Garcia?
Excused.
Dr. Jimenez?
Here.
Ms. Leahy?
Here.
Ms. Moots?
Here.
Mr. Korberg?
Here.
Mr. Spivey?
Absent. A quorum of the Board of Education is present, so the regularly scheduled meeting of March 20th, 2023 is called to order, and we'll now have the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand and face the American flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Make the motion to approve the agenda as presented.
There's
Second.
rock, paper, scissors, anybody? Tonight's agenda has previously been distributed to the board with a motion by Mr. Korberg and a second by Ms. Leahy. We'll approve the agenda as submitted unless there is a motion to amend. Is there a motion to amend? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? Motion has carried, and we will move on to public speakers, and we have no one registered to speak. So we'll move on to the approval of the superintendent's consent agenda.
I'll make a motion to approve the items on the superintendent's consent agenda as presented.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. The consent agenda is a mechanism used by the board to deal with routine business that must come before the body. Are there any items that the members want to remove from the consent agenda? Hearing none, with a motion by Mr. Korberg and a second by Ms. Leahy, the items on the superintendent's consent agenda are approved as presented unless there's objection. Is there any objection? Hearing none, then we'll move on to the approval of the board consent agenda.
And I'll make a motion to approve the items on the board consent agenda as presented.
A second.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Korberg, seconded by Dr. Cooper-Stoll. The items on the board consent agenda will be approved as presented unless any members want to remove something from the consent agenda. Does anybody want to remove anything from the consent agenda? Hearing none, then we will approve the board consent agenda unless there's objection. Hearing no objection, then we'll move on to the information portion, Operational Expectation Monitoring Report, OE10 Learning Environment, and I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Engel.
So this is part of our ongoing monitoring process whereby we ensure that we are meeting the board's expectations. And I will turn it over to Dr. Harsey for this report.
So I'm excited about this report and the fact that we get to talk about children. So in this report in particular has a great deal of student voice centered. So in that regard, it's extremely nice to be with all of you here tonight. This is the third year of this report under coherent governance. In many ways, the data is echoing data that we've had the last two times the report has come forward. And so with that in mind, we'll go through the report, but I would like to maybe adjust it just slightly in that I wouldn't mind talking a little bit about around the narrative. What are we doing about it? Some of these numbers to give the board maybe highlight. I think a lot of it probably you've heard in the past, but just to bring some attention also to some of the efforts being made when you take a look at some of these numbers. So with OE10 in particular, OE 10.1 and OE 10.2, again, are two areas in need of improvement. These two areas are once again not in compliance, just like in 2020-21 school year and 2021-22 school year. So that has been a reoccurring message as this report has come forward. In 10.1, we've established a threshold of 95% of students respond affirmatively to an annually provided survey instrument. That instrument is our student climate survey, indicating feelings of safety, belonging, and support at school. Results of the survey indicated all three categories did not reach our established benchmark. Safety came in this year at 80%, which is slightly higher than last year. Belonging 76%, and then support at 93%. Relative to 10.2 indicator 3, we articulate that the percentage of office discipline offenses and suspensions, exclusionary discipline that is, in terms of in-school suspensions, out-school suspensions for students of color and students being supported through an IEP would be proportionate. However, based on the data from 21-22 school year, that both of those areas. Let's dive here into some of the actual data, specifically in 10.1. Let's take a look at the 2022-23 school climate survey results. I want to point out just a couple of points of emphasis here. So there were 2,432 individual responses, and those are from students grades 3 through 12. We'll get to the charts in just a minute, but I do want to highlight for the board, with that number, 2,432, you know, we set a high mark for accountability with 95% agreeing or strongly agreeing. What that would mean with 2,432 responses, we would need 2,310 of our students, grades 3 through 12, to agree or strongly agree with each of these categories to reach 95%. So only 130 students could disagree or strongly disagree to reach that threshold. I point that out only to say, maybe we want to keep that, maybe we don't. It's going to be difficult for us to ever reach 95%, to get third through 12th graders to agree to that rate. Maybe it's something we want to continue to strive for, but just know that we may be seeing us continually coming back saying, again, we didn't reach 95%. So that's something we can continue to talk about. That being said, we also have some disproportionality to discuss, which could be another matter altogether. For each subcategory, plus and minus percentage variation was identified, much like we did with OE11, and that helped us actually with some conversations. And so based on the district average, we established that. We also took a look at a medical model of disproportionality and the DPIs, and we put ours as a little more stringent, actually at 10%, more stringent than both DPI and the medical model. So we think we're trying to hold ourselves as accountable as possible. So with that, we can take a look at some of this. There's a note at the bottom of this first page I want to highlight as well. It says the school district of Crosse 9th through 12th graders took the Wisconsin Youth Risk Behavior Survey in October 2021. So last year, when I provided this report, there were blanks all over with the YRBS because we try to give comparative data, and we didn't have any of the information from the 2021 YRBS yet. Now we have much of it, but you'll also notice there are still some blanks, for example, with the Wisconsin report for YRBS, because we don't have their full report just yet. We have some of it. So you'll see on like our second chart and our third chart, which are pages 3 and 4 here, we have some of the YRBS data from 2021 from the state of Wisconsin, but not all of it. So I just wanted to highlight that because you might be thinking, well, where is this? What's ironic about this is our students have already taken the 2023 YRBS. So the state is obviously well behind. Part of that is, again, trying to catch up after COVID. So let's take a look quickly at I Feel Safe at School. And I'm going to take a look at, and of course we have pie bar chart and some numerical data. I'm in the numerical charts below here, and I'm going to take a look at total student responses and go horizontally across that line over to the affirmative responses. So these are students who responded with agree or strongly agree. And you can see in 2021, we had a 90.63% rate, 2022, 77.37, and this year we bounced up a little bit from last year to 80.31%. And that's where we based our, off the district average, our plus and minus for disproportionality. You can see with that, we have American Indian or Alaskan, where we're disproportional, based on that 10% plus or minus off of that number. Last year, you can see Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and then our Hispanic and or Latino, Latina. And the one thing I would point out is these are some small sample sizes, And so with those numbers, we call it like noisy data. We could have a few students respond in a slightly different way, and we could see those percentages change greatly. Down below, the asterisk right below, this is genuine student voice. And so students self-identified race, ethnicity, special education services, and language spoken at home. So students had a great deal of say in this particular student climate survey. You can see the 2023, 22, and 21 survey results. And again, it may not match right up above because this is just 9th through 12th graders, because we're trying to match it to the YRBS data taken only through from our high school students right next to it. Again, the 2021 YRBS data for the district, the county, and we do not have the state of Wisconsin's data for this particular question. Going to, I feel like I belong at school, so our belonging question. You can again see the total student responses again across that top line. And you can see we're disproportionate again, American Indian or Alaskan Native. And then down below, you can see last year it was Hispanic, Latina, and then I do prefer not to answer. And then you can see again, comparative data with the climate survey. You can see where the YRBS district data is, La Crosse County and the state of Wisconsin for the last 2 cycles, 2019, 2021. And we do have the state of Wisconsin available to us there. You can see our number is slightly higher. And then finally, there's an adult in my school who will help me if I need it. So we're looking at this as a comparative for support. And you can see our district 2023 affirmative responses was 93.4. And with plus or minus 10%, each of our student groups was proportionate. And again, you can see down below where the student climate survey data was in the YRBS. It's probably important to point out the YRBS removed the encouragement question in 2017 and changed it to support. So that was part of our discussion last year. If you're wondering, you know, wasn't this a question about safety, belonging, and encouragement previously? It was. We made the modification because the YRBS changed their survey, and we thought support might have been more relevant for what we were going for anyway. Support more so than encouragement. Before I move on from this data, go to the next element. Questions on what you're seeing here?
Questions from the board?
Yes, I have one, just because I noticed this, and I know usually we talk about, or we have like the 2 or more category for race. Is there a reason why that's not there?
No.
Okay. I thought the number was off because I was looking and I was like, something's missing.
No, I don't know if we don't offer that with our student climate survey.
Could students select multiple identities?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Engel. Yeah, students can select multiple, and that could be the reason it's not there, Mr. Spivey, because students can select, you know, several. So instead of having fewer options, and then they could select 2 or more, they can pick as many here. So that could be the rationale.
Is that addressed in the analysis? These are just descriptive findings, right?
Yeah.
It's not like any kind of statistical
No.
analysis.
No.
here.
No, we're just relating, so if they identify as white and Asian, they would both be identified there, and then it would just be the percentage for that individual.
But then would their survey results count twice in 2 different categories?
I believe so,
Okay.
but we'd have to look again more closely.
Okay.
I can't confirm the details of that.
No, that's fine. I just thought I would ask because I know we usually have that option within the district, so.
I know that when this survey was developed, there was a question like, well, we can grab all the demographic data off of Skyward and just pre-populate it if we wanted to, in some way. But I think the goal was to put it into students' hands and give them an opportunity to identify how they felt best.
Yeah.
Which is fun. The struggle is always, unless you do any kind of advanced analysis on it, it's hard to tell whether or not there's actually a significant relationship between them here. I have a question, Dr. Harsey.
Please.
The one about the statement, I feel like I belong at school, we developed that one?
We did, yes.
Okay. I just noticed that there was a rather large number of students that check that prefer not to answer that category. So just something to think about in future years.
Yep. Could also be a data point. We noticed that too.
That's,
Yeah.
I think that I prefer not to answer is related to what race they identify as. Or like what, it's not about the question, right? Oh.
But I'm just saying that, that's, yeah, so just something to be thinking about when you're.
Any other questions?
What ideas does the district have for improving these numbers?
Do you want me to talk about that now or after the discipline piece? Because a lot of it braids together.
Okay, whatever you think makes more sense.
Maybe after the discipline
Okay.
piece, okay. And then I prefer not to answer, you can see it's 201 after each, for each question. So I would concur with Ms. Birkendahl saying, I do think that that was associated with the identification of, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, to move on forward?
I'm not hearing any other questions, so yeah, I would go ahead, Dr. Harsey.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next area in 10.2, Code of Rights and Responsibilities for the next couple of indicators. The Board of Education examined the Code of Rights and Responsibilities. First took place August 1st. Mr. Teff came to a school board workshop, shared a presentation, and then we'll see it again here in July as part of GC 6E. And so there's just a couple of links there. Indicator 2, Code of Rights and Responsibilities have been distributed and or made accessible to parents and guardians through the district website, or copies made available to schools for distribution. Again, evidence is just a link, and we do make that just so the board members are aware, available in multiple languages. We do have it linked for Spanish, but it's also available in other languages upon request. And then finally, indicator 3, the superintendent or designee convenes stakeholders annually to review the Code of Rights and Responsibilities to provide comments, suggestions, or input. And you can just see over this last year, the various student, staff, and community groups that had an opportunity to add input to the student code.
And this is still happening, correct?
Yeah, yeah. And these were all just this last year, and it happens on a cycle each year. That's a document that's very, very fluid.
Dr. Harsey, when you mention in indicator 3, the groups that provided feedback, so am I understanding that when it says Central High School, that would be the students at Central High School?
Yeah.
Okay, and would that be the student council or the whole student body?
So a lot of it was student groups like Southeast Asian group, Lit, yeah, and invitations were open. So can I ask, Dr. Jimenez, with that question, does it say on your document Central High School or Central High School students?
On the PDF that I have for indicator 3, it says the following groups provided feedback: Central High School 32422, Logan High School 33022,
Okay.
Logan Middle School.
Mine says student.
Mine says
Okay.
student.
Yeah, mine doesn't, so
Okay,
maybe it just got updated after I had pulled this one up.
okay. I smile only because we were having fits with, and I'll be curious what other edits others may not have received. So thank you for that question,
Yep.
because there could be other elements as we go through this where you didn't receive the edit.
Sure.
So, yeah, every question is certainly welcome, given that, yeah.
I'll reopen it and see what happens.
And just in this section, the staff bullet here, just so you know, that was sent out to building reps, and it was a virtual meeting. And so staff had some input as well. Indicator 4, percentage of office discipline offenses and suspensions for students is proportionate for students of color and students identifying as having a disability. Those data continue to remain disproportionate. Let's dive into the link here and take a closer look. I'll wait on this piece for just a moment and some of the efforts being made, and go scroll down to some of the 2021, 2002 disciplinary data. You can see the bar graph above, which gives you quite a visual indication of the disproportionality. Some way overrepresented, some way underrepresented. I want to just quickly point out what an incident is for the board, so we're clear on, because one graph talks about incidents, another one talks about suspensions. And so in the school district of La Crosse, we have minors and majors, and what you're seeing here are considered majors, which means a principal was involved and some action was taken. So we're talking about things that could be anything from defiance or disruption in the classroom, or vacating a classroom, or vacating the building, or inappropriate technology use, or weapons, or drugs, or violations on a school bus, any and all of those, plus others. But a principal was involved, and depending on, what was happening, let's say there was some disruption in a classroom, that means a principal may have, or administrator in the building may have met with a student, had a conference with a student, made a phone call home, maybe there was some sort of detention, or, any and all of those things would be tallied here under incidents. So those are the kinds of things you're seeing in this particular set of data. And you can see, based on the description above, these following charts, again, we used our plus and minus of the district average, and anything that you see in red is disproportionate. So in every area, you can see that there's disproportionality. This is much like you saw last year and the year before. Now, the chart right below that is our actual suspension information. And you can see something very similar. So you can see these will be ISS and OSS, in-school suspensions and out-of-school suspensions. You can see that we had a total of 503, 8.19%, and then you can see the proportion with each of our groups.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Does this represent actual suspensions given, or the total number of days people were suspended by group?
Actual suspensions.
Okay.
Yep.
Out-of-school suspensions?
ISS and OSS. And then below, and I just want to point out this part because those numbers are so volatile in the annual comparison and student suspensions, that we had COVID in there, right? So we had a year where we left early, a year where we came back in we came back, late in the segmented fashion. So when you look at 2019-20, 2020-21, all of those numbers are undulating quite a bit because we weren't in school consistently. So when you see those numbers, just keep that in mind, like our actual numbers of days face-to-face were all over the map in those years. And so part of what Ms. Berkedahl asked, you can see up above, all right, like what are some of the things that are taking place? But I guess I'd like to just take a moment, and part of what's great about this board is your ability to take in the context of things that are happening now and kind of historical. And what we've been having a lot of conversation about as a district is how hard it is to measure prevention, right? And so when we think about all of the things, like if we were to put a pin in 15 years ago and think about the challenges and the struggles that we were having at that point, and some of the things that our students were coming and saying, here's what I need help with all of the supports and all of the efforts being made at that time, we'd have them licked with the things that we have currently. But a lot has changed. And so in just a quick conversation today, we were talking about, okay, so we 15 years ago would put us back, we would have had that financial crisis, we would have had an opioid epidemic, we would have had a pandemic, we would have had social media explosion, we would have had, there's a lot of stressors on children and families and society and all of those kinds of things. And so through that, all of that, the school district and community at large, all of these helping groups were trying to keep ahead of all of those ramped up challenges and providing buffers. And so while some of these numbers are like, why can't we get ahead of this? Why can't we put a dent in? Part of the efforts are, in part, transformations taking place. And so I do want to just take a moment and talk a little bit about some of the efforts, and you can see some of them here. The DPI, when they talk about, like, there's 3 things you can do about this disproportionality. Here's what they talk about. They talk about school-wide PBIS, which we do in the school district of La Crosse, and we're continuing to work on our fidelity and implementation. They talk about social and emotional learning, which we do in the school district of La Crosse, and we continue to work on our fidelity and implementation. They talk about restorative practices, restorative circles, restorative justice, and we're working on that here in the school district of La Crosse. So in those 3 areas alone, what the DPI recommends, we have those efforts. What I'm so proud about is our working upstream efforts in the school district. So for example, our being proactive efforts, working with, I look at what the board has approved in the community service fund levy, for example. So here are just a few examples of what you've already approved as a board and actually increased funding over the last several years. The YWA Restorative Justice Program has increased over time and grown into multiple buildings. The Shoe-Mullen Community Partnership Program has made a huge difference for students and families. Hinch-and-Huber Neighborhood Project. There's been an updated and continuing to update community needs assessment in some of our most needy neighborhoods. Our professional development examples include everything from trauma-informed to deficit thinking and inclusionary efforts to identity-based harm. And today, our school personnel are working to assist young people that are full of trauma histories and needing supports. Like we didn't provide 5, 10, 15 years, not like this. And so while we've got certainly work to do and want to be held accountable, it is, in a way, there's some celebration in some of the efforts that are taking place. So I would maybe also share the culture of collaboration that's taking place, in understanding of some of the community needs and assets, and the development of some of these effective strategies. And so when we look at even the culture of humility work and creating safe schools and classrooms and the whole child framework, which the board has heard quite a bit about, our system of care work, all of those, to Ms. Birkedal's questions, like what are we trying to do? What are we trying to do to change some of these numbers? One of the things when the work has been done in the community, parents have added thoughtful feedback to a document I'm looking at now for subjective offense guidance. This subjective offense guidance has turned into suspension guidance, which has gone into our student code. And so what I appreciate is the district's growth and its willingness to learn, to listen, and to adapt and improve in its practices. And so those are just a few of the areas. I don't know if that helps in answering your question, but rather than approach it with, well, this is just the way it is, a degree of humility, I'd say is probably one of our greatest assets currently. Questions on the suspension data?
Dr. Marcy, the things that you just listed that we're doing, it's in order to hopefully address the disproportionality, correct? So next year, when this report comes forward, then we would expect to see a difference here, right?
Well, it's going to take some time, right?
Because it seems to me that we also need to stop suspending students of color at higher rates, in addition to those other things. So I just want to be clear that when the report comes forward next year, that if these efforts that we're supporting are successful, we should see a reduction in those numbers, right?
I would think that, like we saw in some of our student climate data, we saw incremental increases. And I think we will continue to see this data trend in the right direction. That's our goal.
I think our schools are a reflection of society, and we make every effort to change our actions here in the school district, and to continue to work on our practices. But there are things that come into our schools that have happened in society. You know, if there's been historic marginalization in our schools, and we recognize that and continue to work on that. But there's also historic marginalization that has occurred in our community and is ongoing. And there are other people that are working on disrupting that. And those things are not things that we have direct control over. We have control over how we interact with kids, the environment that we provide, the responses that we have as adults when things don't go right the first time. But we can't disrupt everything outside of our walls, just the stuff that's in it to the best of our ability. And as long as there's disproportionality out into society, we're likely to see that in our schools as well. No excuses, but it's not going to be, you know, one of those situations where we make technical fixes and put all the things in place and then it just goes away.
I have a question / suggestion. In Skyward, how long does it track their disciplinary reports? Like and I feel like I used to know this answer and I don't know if it's changed, but like if a student gets disciplinary referrals in middle school, do they come in high school? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I can, and I don't know if it's just the access I have, but I can go back and see my daughters, for example, who's a high schooler. I can go back and see her data all the way.
Yeah. I mean, that might be something to look into because I think that has a reflection on some of the statistics too, is that any teacher who has that student can go into the form, right, and look at any disciplinary referral that they've gotten and get those like, yeah. And teachers are doing their best. I think they're awesome, but obviously there's something going on and that might be something to consider.
Thank you.
I think this data is helpful to look at. I think it also shows part of the picture. I think it would be, at least in my mind, more helpful to also see, especially the suspension chart broken out between ISS and OSS and number of days by a different reference group that kids are suspended for.
So there are two things that I think of. One, going back to the student climate survey. So my first question is, in terms of the Native and Indigenous population of students, while I know that the number is low, I still think, you know, seeing the red there is important to acknowledge. And so I'm curious to know, outside of the efforts that you've already talked about, are there intentional efforts working with Native and Indigenous population students and families in the district?
Yeah, part of our obligation through Title VI is to work directly with our families. And so that is part of what we'll do in terms of an action plan. Dr. Agnell and I have already been talking about that.
Okay. And then, I mean, every year, I don't know, when I see the disciplinary suspension and incidents, I feel like the gap closes, then it expands, and no matter what, there's always this disproportionality around it. So I guess my question, because there's a lot of reactionary efforts, there's proactive efforts, there's Band-Aids that we use, right, to solve situations and issues and things like that. I guess my question would be, recognizing the historical marginalization of schools, has there been any interest, any conversations, any groups put together to just address the way in which we do school and how we can do school differently? Now, I get that's a large task and that's a large, probably out there idea, but the reality is schools aren't set up to benefit people. So if we continue to do reactionary and to some degree proactive measures, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to address this issue until we address breaking down the system and rethinking the way in which we do this. And I get that's an unfair question probably to ask, but I'm just curious if you all are having those conversations, be it from a system level, even if it's just individual conversations, but I think it's comforting for me to just hear that there must be something being talked about, or some sort of action that's getting us to a place where we question the way in which we've done school for 100+ years.
So over the last, this won't necessarily address specifically your question, but over the last year and a half to two, we've had 60 to 90 minute meetings at all these different levels throughout our district and outside of our district with stakeholders, retired educators, people who are concerned about the welfare of children in the district. And some of those very questions have come up. And this has been spearheaded through contracted service with SRS.
Okay.
And so some of those have been put on the table, and the topics have ranged from some of that I mentioned here, but some of them have been can you reimagine school? And so, yes, and digging this all up and turning it on its ear takes a bit.
Yeah, I'd say, Polytechnic is a way to reimagine school, through a project-based learning lens. And that doesn't mean it's situated in disrupting, historical inequities, but it is a different way to approach school that kind of flips things on its head and puts more power in students' hands to navigate their path forward there. I would say that our standards-based grading effort is something that is not how school was done for 200 years, but we know that it's better for kids. It gives them clear learning targets, gives them multiple opportunities to succeed, and leads to greater levels of motivation and engagement. So there's things that are going on throughout our schools where it's not wholesale change, like burn it all down, but there is very intentional efforts to do what's best practice, what's best for kids. Our educators' capacity for change is only so great, and we can try and turn it on its head, but I don't know what we'll have on the other end of that, just in terms of capacity. And so, from a realistic perspective, being able to target it and addressing those things that we can feel we make as quick a movement on as we can.
So one of the things when I read through this policy and some of the evidence that was given to support that we're meeting the values of the policy was the interpretation is very heavily discipline based, disciplining students. With some of the data from the students' own voices that we've collected and from these suspensions kind of indicates the mental health needs of the students, which we also know they've spoken before us, that sort of thing. And I think this is a conversation more for later, but I think a piece missing is also some of that mental health, what, in addition to these systems that help educators understand how to approach children, what are the services or what are the ratios between, school counselors and students and that sort of thing that shows that we are trying to come around the problem and in more of a preventative right? Like, so suspension is like a result of, you know, a mental health something, some of the times. And I feel like as I read through the policy language and as I looked at the indicators, the interpretation is very heavy on discipline, if that makes sense. Less so on those mental health supports or the mental health needs of students. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And
Okay.
thank you for sharing that, because we don't know, like, for example, when we put in, like, the attachment, some of the things we're doing, we put whole child framework. Now, the board has had information on whole child framework, and within some of that, there's been a lot of that information, and it's interesting to hear that perspective, because we could have certainly added more meat to the bone there, gotten into the weeds. I struggled with, well, how much would that feel like redundancy for the board if that was part of but that's great to hear that that's of interest, you know, when it's already been presented
Sure.
formally.
Yeah, well, I think just in terms of like monitoring the effectiveness of the programs over time, like in a board monitoring the district in this, you know, in these areas, like even if we've had a workshop, monitoring over time might be useful, especially as these needs like grow in the district.
Yeah, no, that's great.
I think that's something that could easily be added to OE 10.1, you know, in terms of like the definition of climate, you know, show me the norms, values, expectations that support people feeling socially, emotionally, physically safe, you know, that social emotional piece, access to services, ratios could be something in there, you know, how do we compare to state or federal,
Right.
you know, guidelines? And that would be a way to track those things that we're doing that impact that student climate survey result.
Yeah. I think that would be helpful, just to see over time. I think, you know, when we get our workshops, it's great because you get, you know, this deep information, deep dive. But just in terms of that, like, accountability piece, like, if the board is accountable to the public and the district is accountable to the board, if we're tracking these things, then we can point to specific, like, this is our trend over time, this is where efforts are, that sort of piece.
Absolutely.
And the other thing I would add is I also want to, you know, give y'all the accolades and praise for the work that you are doing this is annoying, to address these issues, right? Because even when I talk about, like, well, let's reimagine school, I think the efforts that are put before us that shows that, hey, we're looking at cultural humility, we're looking at, you know, how do we bring in community supports to help our students, mental health supports to help our students. We're going out, we're seeking input from families and organizations on disciplinary actions and things like that. I think that's really big and monumental changes for some schools, right? And so I just want to give you accolades and say, like, I appreciate that you are doing these efforts to address this. I know sometimes I've come off because I'm just very, like, anti-system sometimes. But I really do appreciate the efforts that you all are putting forth in this district to make sure that every student feels safe, appreciated, and valued and respected. And I think you all have to, you know, acknowledge the teachers, acknowledge the other supports, if they're listening to this, to just say thank you for that, because that's important.
Any other comments? Okay. So hearing none then, where is the board at in regard to where we're landing after the presentation on this OE? Yeah.
Like, we were at 10.3, do you want me to?
Oh, that's right, we still have two more. Yeah, I keep forgetting that there's more because those were the two highlighted
Yeah,
ones
those
that
are
we
the-
needed,
yeah,
that
those are the-
concerns. The other ones didn't seem to
Absolutely.
have any issues. So, yeah, I apologize. Please. go
And
ahead.
these
I
aren't nearly
apologize.
as deep of wells here.
Yeah.
So 10.3, the indicator 1, the district will provide all primary guardians public notice of the types of information designated as directory information, and will be informed of their right to remove all or part of directory information. that they do not wish to be available to the public without their consent by a time designated by the district. So we just submit link the actual form there, and then the dates that we had that available. Keep in mind that a family, we do that, supply that also to new families as they come in. And a family, if they wish, could change their designation, just submit it, that request in writing. They could do that at any time. In Indicator 2, 100% of research requests for student information are reviewed for alignment to district mission and vision. You can see we link in there all of basically our R&D committee's expectations in protection of student and staff. And then those are the 5 that we had this past year in terms of research efforts. 10.4, Indicator 1, 100% of formal reports of misconduct by an adult are investigated by an appropriate member of the administrative team. We did have one this year that required investigation. Ami Zabrowski took the lead on that investigation. And I think in the compliance letter, it said it was being investigated at the time, and that has since been submitted. 10.5, policies and procedures for responding to concerns and complaints are in place and on a regular review cycle. The first link there is just our annual review cycle. And we continue to work on moving all of our policies over to Neola, but those are policies there that you can see linked that would associate to if somebody had a concern. They have a variety of policies in which they could share those with us and begin a process. Questions on anything from 10.3 to 10.5?
Any questions? Not hearing any. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Jimenez.
Thank you, and thank you for pulling me back on those. So again, back to the action of the board, or should I say just a discussion of where you all are at in terms of this OE. Are you feeling that you are in alignment with the superintendent's recommendation, which is that we are in compliance with exceptions noted, or is there a different option we would prefer as a board? I'm not hearing any dissension, so I'm assuming we're in alignment with the superintendent's recommendation. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Then with that, we will move on to announcements, and I'll turn it over to Ms. Baumann.
Yeah, so just briefly, the Gold Star grants were reviewed last week. Announcements about award winners will be coming out soon. By midnight tonight, if you have a Shining Star staff member to nominate, the LPEF is accepting nominations for Who's Your Shining Star. 2 dates to add to your calendars. Thank a Teacher will be May 9th. If board members want to participate in that, they can. And then the Bowtie Classic Golf Outing is September 9th. And that's all I have today.
All right. I do not have any announcements this evening. Dr. Engel?
Just a quick legislative update. The Joint Finance Committee announced 4 public hearings on the 23-25 state budget. Those are Wednesday, April 5th in Waukesha, Tuesday, April 11th in Eau Claire, Wednesday, April 12th in Wisconsin Dells, and Wednesday, April 26th in Minocqua. If anyone has an interest in testifying at the Joint Finance Committee, I did it 2 years ago. It was a little scary, but I figured it out, and it was a good process to make our voice heard. I intend to speak at the April 11th one in Eau Claire. The other 4 superintendents in the county and I are going to go up as a group. Gives you a little more time to speak. But if board members would like to come or speak, I can talk you through what that process looks like and help support you in that endeavor. It's a good opportunity to ensure that our state legislators hear our voice. That's all I have.
Thank you very much. So we'll move on to agenda planning.
I'll make a motion to approve the April 3rd, 2023 Board of Education agenda with any additions or corrections.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by Mr. Korberg, seconded by Mr. Spivey to approve the April 23rd, 2023 Board of Education agenda with any additions or corrections. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion has carried, and we will move on to board debriefing. Is there any comments that board members would like to share in the board debriefing? I think with one agenda item, not a lot to debrief. I think there's a lot of great comments and insights into OE10, so I appreciate the board's due diligence in reviewing that prior to the meeting. And so with that, we will adjourn to the workshop unless Ms.
Sorry, I just had a
Birkenau.
quick
Yep.
question about process. So if we wanted to consider Dr. Hersey's consideration of, do we want to keep the threshold at 90%, 95% or higher? Like, if we wanted to change that, would we have discussed that and voted on that right then and there? Like, what would the process for doing that be?
The next meeting, right?
Yeah, that would come forward at the next board meeting. So if you have suggestions, I would bring those
Okay.
with to the next board meeting about, and then we can have a discussion as a board and make that decision.
Okay.
Anything else? Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Are we downstairs? I'm sorry.
Upstairs.